Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre, with me is Z. Today we have a mix of topics, starting off with a post from Zero Day Initiative on their highlights, trends, and challenges from threat hunting in 2024. So in this post, they go into quite a bit of details on a few different subjects and things that they think are worthy of calling out. Starting off with their in the wild zero-day discoveries. So these are things that they discovered being used by threat actors in some capacity, whether that be criminal groups or even they have like an APT group one for their first issue. Fair amount of them are like smart screen prompt feature bypasses and Windows and mark of the web bypasses and things of that nature. So not like some of the lower level bugs you might expect from like Google's threat analysis group or something like that.
Yeah, although I will call out, I do want to call out one of them here being the MS HTML platform spoofing. And that was the gist of this one is the whole Trident engine of like Internet Explorer. It's technically on like it's disabled in Windows 10 and Windows 11. But what I guess they were able to do, this Void Banshee campaign that they're calling it, basically had a bug that would let them still gain access to Trident so then they could use older like Internet Explorer bugs. I just thought it was interesting that that's the approach. Rather than finding newer bugs in like the harder surface, it's finding ways to access the easier surface, which makes sense in terms of trying to find the weakest link. I just thought it was interesting. There aren't a lot of details here about it. They do link off to like the CVE, but I don't think there's any real write-up about this. They just say MIME encapsulation of aggregate HTML documents or MHTML handlers to reactivate Internet Explorer. So probably dig into that a little bit and just find like, oh, if you use whatever file type or whatever, it gets accessed by something Windows still has for MHTML files. Either way, I just thought it was kind of fun that they're still going after those Trident bugs.
Yeah, so as you say here, there's not a ton of technical details in the post beyond a brief summary of the CVEs. The main thing that they go into in the post is their sort of thoughts and observations, I guess, of what's been found in the wild and the trends. So a few of them are kind of bog standard, what you'd expect, like the increase in sophistication of phishing, but by tying in the use of LLMs and whatnot. That's I think pretty much everyone knows about that. There's some other ones that are kind of timeless in the fact that they're always a problem, such as being able to easily find variants due to incomplete patches and error patching. That's something they call out. Where it gets a little bit more interesting, I think, is the issues with coordinated vuln disclosure and the flaws in CVSS scoring. And that's partially because those who have listened to us for a while can probably remember times where we've ranted a little bit on CVSS and why we don't like it as a system.
CVSS flaws feels a little bit timeless too. Actually, as you
Yeah.
were saying about the timeless ones, I immediately scrolled down to flaws in CVSS scoring and the issues with coordinated vulnerability disclosure, and then you went with, nope, I'm talking about narrow patching.
Well, so the thing with the CVSS scoring is I do agree that I think it's always kind of been a problem, but I feel like it's becoming more and more of a problem as time goes on, where you're getting increasing numbers of vulnerabilities that don't fit into the nice little buckets that CVSS has set up. Like as vulnerability research and the security landscape evolves, it feels like CVSS falls behind even more, year by year. So that's kind of why I was thinking of that.
Yeah, the scope of the vulnerabilities being found and how they have an impact is just wildly different than what the scoring system is really going for. And I mean, there's even like there's a side that we tend to take where we talk about it's not really accounting for like the application's intent, anything specific there, but there's also just a side of what they call out here, ZDI calls out like the likelihood of exploitation. How likely is somebody to actually write an exploit of the issue? And I know when we've talked about in the past, well, I'll often kind of ignore that point. Is like the vulnerability is the vulnerability regardless of whether or not somebody's written an exploit for it. And so like, they're even taking it in a different way than I think we've talked about in the past. And completely legitimate when you're you're a large corporation, you have a lot of software, and you want to consider which bugs do I need to invest time into. Like, it's all about how you're trying to prioritize and who's trying to prioritize. Because I think the impact is different if you're the vendor creating the software, needing to update the software, versus somebody needing to mitigate the bug that exists in like your software. You have very different perspectives on that. And this one score just doesn't really cover it well, but we don't really have anything else that really does it. I will say some companies do have more of an internal scoring system that they kind of go about trying to apply. Like, there are some other things there, but nothing really solves it. It's just you're trying to boil something kind of complex down to a number, just a single number, and that's just it's going to miss things.
Yeah, just in general in the security space, it's really hard to benchmark and apply metrics to things. Like we've talked about that with fuzzing before, for example, where it's like, how do you benchmark a fuzzer? How do you boil that down to a number? And it just comes down to the fact that like vulnerabilities and these things are just hard to sum up in that way. And that applies to CVSS. So yeah, it's not really the system's fault all on its own. It's just a hard problem, I guess.
Yeah,
But
like
yeah, like
CVSS is trying to solve a particular problem, but I think it's also just being tossed onto a lot of problems that's not really good for solving.
yeah, and people give it a lot more merit than they should because like you see it all the time where somebody that's trying to like get into vulnerability research or like I want to find a CVSS 10.0 vulnerability. Like, you know, it's like people tend to look at it kind of the wrong way and treat it as a lot more accurate and like a ground truth where it shouldn't be. And that's common. Like I feel like even industry like companies and stuff do that too, where they just uh and they kind of have a point about that in this post. So like one quote I'll call out is some of these vulnerabilities may or may not even make it past the triage process, even though they match criteria sought after by threat actors as part of a phishing campaign, for example. We've also noticed that many vulnerabilities rated as critical or high are not actively exploited. And that's kind of the problem is that with these numbers, there's kind of a misalignment with how vulnerabilities are actively being taken advantage of and their actual impact versus what the number is due to some criteria and trying to fit it into a bucket. So it's easy for people to like misinterpret the impact of a bug and make bad decisions because of it.
Yeah, and
So
I do. I don't know if I'm going to take some flack for saying this, but I feel like the CIA triad is part of the issue too. Confidentiality, integrity, availability. If focusing on those as three equal parts, they're often just not equal. Availability may matter a lot more, matter a lot less. Like, you might have an application that's all public data, so there isn't really a degree of confidentiality. I mean, there's probably some little secrets there, but like, it's these three foundational, and I think it's very useful for thinking about like a system, to think about like the triad. But when it comes to scoring vulnerabilities, where it's just like, a high availability impact is the same as a high integrity impact, whereas in practice, business considerations are likely going to make those pretty different. And then there's, kind of the other aspects like repudiation or even some of that, which aren't really captured.
and another point that I think ties nicely with something we've talked about recently is there are issues with coordinated vuln disclosure. And what this section basically boils down to is talking about the miscommunications that can arise and the hostility that can arise between vendors and security researchers and how that can impact how well the bugs are being fixed or if they're being fixed at all, things of that nature. And again, kind of bringing up LLMs a little bit, like we saw with the Curl report, where there's some AI slop reports and whatnot. I think that's also contributing to potentially damaging that relationship as a whole and making companies not want to bother with bug reports in the same way. Like it can be harder to parse through them and do that triaging, and that's just generally work that uh is found to be annoying. Like it's not really the thing that most people want to go after when they're working at a company, right?
So I think like LLMs are definitely aggravating that a bit, but we have always had the big bounties and like the well, maybe not
100%.
always, but
I'm
you
just
know,
saying
there's
technology is kind of making it worse.
yeah, it's definitely aggravating it. There's also though been there's a long history of corporations having all the power. And that has been changing, and a lot of corps don't necessarily like the fact that the researchers have a bit of power in terms of reputational damage. And I'm not a fan of just trying to raise awareness or like raise the mob on social media. I'm not really a fan of that, but that is kind of a reality of some vulnerability research these days, is that they raise the attention that way rather than actually working with the company, and they actually have power when the company decides to screw over the researcher. 'Cause for a long time it was all responsible disclosure. Corporation has all the power to decide when you can or even if you can disclose. At least they are talking a little bit about coordinated disclosure here and not responsible disclosure. If you're unfamiliar with the difference there, coordinated disclosure kind of has a bit more of a balance of power where both parties are technically have to agree or both parties can kind of break off. Responsible disclosure is effectively until the vendor patches that you cannot disclose. They take 5 years to do so, doesn't matter. Or they decide not to do it, doesn't matter. Responsible disclosure kind of sits on that side. Coordinated disclosure brings a bit more power back to the researcher. I don't that's not really brought up in this blog at all. That's more my issue or my soapbox, I guess, a bit.
And on a sort of similar note to the miscommunication between the vendors and researchers, they also call out siloed product teams, basically talking about the fact that the way that some of these companies work and have their product teams siloed and have them isolated from each other can also cause another point of breakdown in the communication where uh it's reported and say the security team sees it and is like, yep, this looks like a legitimate issue, and then they have trouble forwarding that on to developers to actually get it fixed.
Well,
And that's something that we've seen before too, in some
I'm not
cases.
sure that's quite what they're talking about with this. Because with the silo teams, it's more the idea you have similar attack surface across multiple products. And so you'll have one developer team that's like, okay, we fix this. But then you'll have the same attack surface somewhere else at another product that doesn't get the notice that like, hey, there's this vulnerability. So it ties in actually with variant hunting, which is something they raised kind of earlier on in this post, where you'll have a variant in a similar product. In this case, you have the siloed product team. So you have two products, same company, different teams working on them. One team aware of this attack surface. Oh, we had this issue. We fix it, and they don't pass it on to the other team where they have the same issue. And that's something you kind of see just you can think about as like, okay, you're misusing, maybe it's misusing the internal API, maybe it's misusing something else, but for some reason, maybe centrally in their wiki, they have example code that misuses um some library that introduces a vulnerability, gets exploited in one place, and they don't really spread that knowledge out like, oh, this pattern's actually wrong.
Yeah. But overall, what I found interesting was a fair amount of the points that are brought up in this post, while some of them are like obvious and, as we said, sort of timeless. um Pretty much all of them we've seen various examples of throughout the year, just covering stuff on the podcast. And to be to be quite frank with you, it seems like things are getting worse. I almost feel like the time when companies took security seriously and tried to improve the overall like security model is kind of behind us. The reason I say that is, again, talking about LLMs. I mean, if you can kind of figure out from the way I'm talking about them that I really don't like the way AI and LLMs have shaped things. But I feel like there's a lot of stuff that's just being shoved into automation, and we'll try to deal with this in the cheapest way possible instead of trying to deal with it like the problems as a whole, because that's harder and more expensive. Maybe I just have a bit of a nihilistic take on it, but
I mean, security has always been something that it's a cost center and companies want to keep their costs down. In general,
agreed.
there are some companies that invest more or less into it, but that has always been a thing. One of the things that I actually want to bring out about this post was they do talk about their. So it starts off talking about some of their in the wild things they've seen, threat groups actually using, and then they go into their ODA research and actually finding new vulnerabilities or new issues. And so they kind of call out effectively two methodologies towards it. It's two things we've talked about before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's just one taking the approach of variant hunting, where one vulnerability, they kind of blame this just on narrow patching, which I'm not. It depends on how you want to interpret narrow patching, I guess. But like, because I don't think it's always the case that it's just, oh, they didn't patch the root cause, so the same bug exists elsewhere. Sometimes it's just the same code pattern happens in multiple places and they are fairly independent. Uh, but yeah, the idea of just hunting variants, have one bug, it's likely either the same developer or another developer would have made a very similar mistake somewhere else on another application. In their cases, they're using like mark of the web bypass, so they find like the same sort of bypass, slightly different area, and it's like very similar kind of bugs going on. And the other one they kind of call out is looking across products or across implementations, which is another strategy we've talked about where you take a technology, you learn about a specific technology, and then you compare implementations of that, like say protocol, whatever. You compare implementations and where they deviate. You kind of look to see if there's a bug in those deviations. In this case, their approach was more like they found a mark of the web in this type of functionality on one product, so then they went and looked at, or they saw it being used in the wild actually. So then they went and looked at the same sort of functionality in another application, in this case Dropbox's desktop folder sharing. They found another mark of the web bypass that was very similar to one they saw in the wild, just looking basically same functionality, and how does a different product actually deal with it in the same functionality, or if they don't, you've got a vulnerability there. So still kind of going variant hunting, but two different approaches on how you kind of do that. It's two things we have talked about a number of times before, and just two ways of kind of approaching looking for ODAs beyond just reading the code and finding the bugs, like different conceptual approaches or structures, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, kind of a overall interesting post and sums up some of the problems that are plaguing security fairly well. That said, I don't know how hopeful I am on any progress actually being made to address those, because as we've said, a fair amount of these have been problems for a long time, and uh, yeah, it's just how it is at the moment, at least. So we can move into some vulnerabilities. So our first vulnerability post here is by JPRX, and is a pretty interesting bug in the macOS kernel. So what was pretty funny about this bug is it was extremely easy to trigger. All you had to do was have macOS 15 compiled with KSAN, kernel address sanitizer, and if you just ran sysctl-a, you would trigger a crash. You would trigger an invalid 4-byte load. So very easy bug to trigger. The bug is ultimately in the sysctl UDP log port function, and it's very stupid. Basically, the handler casts the argument that's passed into it for the local or remote port as an 32-bit integer, but it's actually only a 16-bit integer. So you have 2 bytes that are overread, so you could potentially leak some data there. That's really all there is to the bug. They kind of pocket showing leaking some memory, like they set up some memory afterwards of it that are like ABCD, and they show leaking those bytes. How practical this actually is for an attack is, you know, kind of questionable. They kind of talk about that in the what we can leak section, where they say it depends, kind of depends on the linker and what the layout, the memory layout is there. And of course, like when you're talking about 2 bytes, especially where it's the least significant 2 bytes of whatever is next, even if you're leaking a pointer or something, that's not going to be super useful. Generally, like, even if you're looking to defeat ASLR, the ASLR bytes are going to be in the upper bits of the pointer. They're not going to be in the lowest 2 bytes, right? So probably not a super useful exploit, but it is a pretty funny bug. And the patch is also funny to look at because you look at it and it's literally just changing it so that it casts their read is cast as a UN16 instead of an int. So, just kind of a funny bug there. But
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a
I
funny
mean, people
issue,
were
and
memeing on it because it's Apple. You kind of expect stronger code quality there.
the fact that it's reachable with just the sysctl dash a giving you the crash is also pretty funny. Like, just the fact that it's hit so trivially.
Yeah.
Now, granted, it does take you running this with KSAN. Like, you do kind of need that, which introduces the crash. Otherwise, like, this isn't a crashing bug, but that's what KSAN does.
Mhm. So yeah, I mean, not too much to talk about there, but just more proof that even in what is generally considered to be a hardened code base, you can still have those kinds of meme issues. I believe part of that is because of the FreeBSD history, which there's been cases before of macOS and iOS and X and U, I guess, just in general inheriting bugs from FreeBSD. Um,
Yeah, it's even though it is a hardened target, but like I said, it also has that history, fairly old code, and people just make mistakes. That is ultimately what it comes down to. No matter how good the developer is, people still make mistakes.
yeah. Getting into another post that made the rounds, there was a GitHub gist that was put out on a vulnerability that was discovered that allowed de-anonymization via Cloudflare. So this was by a researcher, Hacker Mundev, who claims to be a high school student. And yeah, it has to do with basically abusing Cloudflare's caching and their CDN to de-anonymize. So Z, I'll let you get into the details.
Yeah, and with this one, there's definitely some questions over how useful this is. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but core issue is obviously Cloudflare. They have a lot of data centers. They have, the data centers are going to store, if you can have cache information, stuff's going to get stored in one of those or one or more of those data centers once it's been accessed. Kind of makes sense. General way that works is as you would expect. You make a request for some asset, your request is going to hit whatever, assuming this, if it's not going through Cloudflare, obviously this doesn't matter, but assuming you're dealing with something hosted behind Cloudflare and all of that stuff, you'll hit a Cloudflare data center and it's going to be like, hey, do we have this in our cache? If yes, they're going to serve it from the cache. If no, they're going to request from the origin and then save it in the cache for some period of time depending on configuration. And so what this relies upon is knowing, or there's kind of one thing that's kind of a bug, because you're not really supposed to be able to make requests of a specific data center. You should just end up at your local data center, whatever whatever requests you try and make. But the core issue is just one, when you make those requests of Cloudflare, it does tell you if there was a hit in the response information. You do get the little header indicating like, yeah, this was a cache hit or a cache miss, and also tell you I guess the airport code of the data center, so whatever airport it's kind of closest to. Given that information, if you were able to make requests of a specific data center in order to determine like, hey, was this request filled, or was this request fillable by this data center, like with a cache hit, you could then determine if a user had loaded it from that. So they start off with just the simple example of trying to hit Namecheat's fav icon, which is just, you load up a website, you get the little icon on the URL, or not URL bar, but like the tab bar. Get the little icon there, that's the fav icon. So you access the site. And they were basically able to go, they did have a way of making requests to specific data centers. And so they were able to go and kind of run through and see they got a hit of like IAD in Boston, YYZ, whatever the airport code was. And they work out what all of them are, like the cities that they represent. But to say like, okay, somebody in the last 5 minutes would have made, given the caching rules, would have made a request for the Namecheap website, and they're kind of finding out information about the user that accessed it. How they actually make the request to each data center is using CloudFlare Teleport, which they basically put together a tool based on trying to run workers on a specific data center. The gist of how this works, I did not go take a look at the code, so I'm just relying on how they describe it here, is normally when you try and access one of the Cloudflare data centers just directly, it's going to block inbound connections. However, if you're trying to access from a Cloudflare IP, so you're already kind of inside the Cloudflare network, it will then accept the request. And so by using Cloudflare's VPN, or like Cloudflare Warp, or just edge workers, or the way they describe it here is by using an IP range used internally by Cloudflare Warp, you can make those requests. You'd be internal. It would be like, oh, this is coming from Cloudflare, and it's okay. But then they kind of switch down here. A request sent from workers could bypass this, since connections would originate from inside the Cloudflare network. So like I said, I haven't looked at how the code itself works. I'm assuming they're just creating workers and using that, but they also talk about Cloudflare Warp. I'm not sure about the connection there. It is a tool, include the link here, so you can take a look if you want. Ultimately, though, what they have is the ability to make requests to a specific data center and determine, hey, does this data center have this image cache? So what can you actually do with that? That's where the de-anonymization attack comes in, and they start with an example on Signal. You send an image to somebody, Signal then has their CDN set up. That's behind Cloudflare. It's going to cache that image once it's been loaded. So that would require that a user actually views the image, like opens their chat to see the image, and then you can, once they've done that, you can then make a request to all the data centers and see which data center has cached this image and kind of know a rough location for the user. So you do get a bit of information. They do have a 0-click. If you have notifications on Signal, it can send you a push notification that if you include content, can include, or will basically mean it will pull down the image and you'll
it'll
make
have it
that
as like a
request.
thumbnail.
Yeah, they have the example here. And it's a very similar attack actually against Discord, except using the profile image. That would also go through a Cloudflare cache using the profile image. So you can send a friend request to somebody, and when that request gets made, hits the cache, you can then check which cache loaded that image. So there's a couple things here. One, I think there's a challenge that isn't talked about a ton through here, but you have to know when to actually try and hit these caches, because when you make the request to see if the cache has it, you're also loading it into the cache. So if you make that request before the image has been loaded, or after it's been dropped from the cache, like we talked about the Namecheap example, those were holding in cache for 5 minutes.
That's a very small window in the grand scheme of things.
You would have to know exactly when. So the 0-click attacks, I think that's kind of practical to do, because it's like the push notification. Odds are you just wait 4 minutes and that push notification will have been made and you'll be good. Like there's a chance phone's off or something and it's not being hit, but there's a pretty good chance that you can just like do that. And I don't know what the configuration for Signal or Discord is for how long they're holding in cache. They may have longer windows. I don't think it's brought up in here, or if it is, I just missed it.
So just based on my understanding, and maybe my understanding is wrong, but because this is going to be cached locally by the data center, as long as you're attacking someone that wouldn't be on the same data center as you, you should be able to probe it at any rate you want, right? Like even if you get it loaded into the cache, it's not going to load it into your victim's data center's cache.
Well, no, you have to, in order to check if that victim data center has loaded it, because you don't know which data center they're in. So one, they might be in your same data center, but so I'm just scrolling up on the example with Namecheap. Like in order to check if it's a hit against Newark or against Ashburn or Boston, you have to make a request to it via that data center, which means the second time you make the request, it's going to be a cache hit.
Okay.
So like you're modifying that you are loading it every time you check the data center also.
Okay, I think I got you. Okay.
Yeah, so depending on the window you've got, that can be a challenge. and depending on how quickly you can expect it. Like with the Discord friend request, you may be able to expect that to be reached relatively quickly and have a pretty good idea over when that's going to happen, whereas opening a Signal chat is going to be a lot more difficult to hit that window, especially if we are talking about the 5-minute window. But again, it depends on configuration. And it actually, looking at one of the screenshots here, I do notice on Signal, you could see one of these cache hits had an age of, oh, maybe that's, I was going to say this, so I can see the age here being 5 minutes, 272 seconds.
That is weird.
Well, so what I think's going on there is 300 seconds, I believe, is 5 minutes. And so I think it's rounding it. I thought that was more than 5 minutes, but that might be just under 5 minutes. Either way, point being, there is that window, there is that bit of a challenge here. It can de-anonymize users, but you do kind of need that timing. So 0-click feels like the most effective way to do this. Unless you're like actively in the chat or have like read receipts. If you're doing it on another platform with read receipts, that could be another thing to kind of help you get the timing exactly right. Because it is, I think, an interesting attack. And one of the criticisms I saw of this was, well, you're only finding out if they're like
you're not getting precise location data.
Yeah, you're not getting super precise location data. And I think that is fair. Like for me, I wouldn't care a lot if people knew, like, I have no idea if there's a CloudFlare data center in Regina, but like that's my nearest international airport. I don't care if people know that. Like that's kind of public knowledge about me. And I think for a lot of people, this wouldn't really matter. Like, but a platform like Signal, like Telegram, these are platforms where people are trying to at least be a little bit more secure and prevent some of that information. So I think it's still an interesting attack. Viability, like this isn't a threat where I'm going to be like warning my mom about this de-anonymization threat sort of deal. This is, if you really kind of care about OPSEC, you can maybe be aware of this. But again, actually, if you're using like a VPN, it should show like the VPN location. So there's kind of that sort of feed, but it is still kind of an interesting bit of information with regards to what you're able to pull out here. And I think it's still an interesting attack. Definitely not something we've talked about a bunch before. I feel like we have talked about de-anonymization before, but I don't recall when.
Yeah, it's been a while. I agree. Like using data centers and caching as an oracle in this way is just really cool. Even if the impact might not be there for most people. Where I would say, like, the person saying that it's not a precise location might be, not counting very well, is something like journalists, right? High value targets where you have like journalists or things like this, just knowing like the rough city that they're in can be very impactful to them. Now, ideally, you kind of hinted at it there, like they probably should be using like a VPN or something to help with anonymizing themselves. But if they're not, it could be a problem, because if you're being targeted by like a nation state or someone that is well resourced, being able to pin down your location to a city or even a country can be a huge step in trying to track you down further. So there definitely is an impact here, even if it's not really an issue for most people. So yeah, that criticism is a little bit like unfounded, I think. Just because it doesn't impact everybody doesn't mean it's not important.
Yeah, it just comes down to what your threat model is. Personally, like this isn't a threat model I'm worried about, because actually I don't even know what, I feel like the data center, I kind of want to look it up now, but I feel like whatever data center I'm close to is probably going to be quite far from me, just given my location. But it's not my threat model. But like I said, there definitely are people for whom this is in their threat model, and it does matter. So I think it's a cool attack. It's a good find. Like, it's a good thought process in terms of like, how could I use this cache hit information to my benefit? What other information could I basically side channel or oracle out of this? So yeah, I think it's a good find.
So something that's a little bit interesting is when they talk in the bug bounty report section about how this was received. So the Signal and Discord just kind of didn't really care about it, honestly. They dismiss it saying it's, Signal was like, this isn't really our responsibility. They're not trying to replicate the full set of network layer anonymity features that something like Tor would provide, which the author kind of disagrees with, and I also sort of disagree with, because Signal does position itself as like a privacy centric communication platform, which they call it here. But the fact that like it's not really their responsibility and it is something more on Cloudflare, I do kind of agree with. Now Cloudflare had already knew about the ability to traverse the data centers. So that bug had been reported previously, but they hadn't really done anything about it because they didn't see the impact. So after this report, they had reopened it, awarded the $200 bounty to the researcher that originally reported it, as well as the author here. But they didn't. So according to the author, they didn't really fix the core issue.
Yeah, so I'm reading this here. I'll be honest, when I read this, I did kind of scan it more so than reading everything, as we try and get through a lot. I do notice, actually, I don't think what they're talking about here is the same thing with Cloudflare Warp. So they talk about I chose a VPN provider, so it doesn't seem like they're using Cloudflare Warp. I think they're just using the fact that a VPN is going to have servers close to all of these Cloudflare data centers, or, possibly even in or appearing with them directly, giving them kind of access to have it fulfilled by it, even if they're not making the request directly to it. And there's nothing really Cloudflare could do about that,
Okay.
because it's being filled by the correct cache. Like, they don't know your actual location, they know where the request is originating from, and so they're using a VPN to kind of hide that. When I do want to comment though, when you talk about Signal, I kind of understand why Signal might, and even if Discord looks like Discord actually might have made, or at least looked into trying to make changes on this. Yeah, looks like Discord team promised to look in and make changes to protect users against the type of attack, but eventually they changed their position on this. There isn't like, I feel like the solution to this is generally just using a VPN. It is using something that provides you the location anonymization. There isn't really, unless you, I guess one solution could be Cloudflare gets rid of informing you about cache hits through the headers. That is a pretty extreme case for them to just like no longer do that. I'd want them to
I think
provide
that could be
another.
problematic.
Oh, it would easily be problematic. They would have to provide
Yeah.
another way for you to find out about the cache hits and stuff, because that is useful for developers trying to troubleshoot caching problems.
Yeah.
So they would need something else, but like that would be one thing, to remove that as an oracle by not informing you about it. Uh or requiring that you like include a particular header first in order to get that information back could be another way of doing it. That's going to increase processing time though, and could be
That's completely
problematic,
against why
but
you want to use a CDN in the first place.
well, no. So you would still get like the cache providing the response. You'd still get all the benefits of the CDN. You just wouldn't get the extra headers back that inform you about like cache hit or cache miss, unless you included like a domain key or something in the request
Oh, I see what you mean.
itself, so that you'd still get the headers when you made that request to test it, but you wouldn't get it on like a browser's normal request. So you could still like test the endpoint. It's not a perfect solution. Um, but like there isn't much that Signal could really do about it, unless, or Discord could even do about, unless they just proxied the request. They did it and they made the
Yeah.
request anywhere else and then didn't use the cache, and then you're losing the caching.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'd said too, where it's like I kind of agree with them where they say that it's not their responsibility, and like there's not much they can do about it,
Oh,
because
I might have misheard you earlier. I thought you said you disagreed on it.
so what I disagreed with was Signal's initial dismissal, saying that it's not their responsibility to hide their identity, that Signal has never attempted to fully replicate the anonymity features. That's where I kind of disagree and say that Signal has kind of pushed itself as more of a privacy centric and secure platform. But I do agree with the fact that this is on Cloudflare, not on Signal or Discord.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to
It's
me
a bit
though,
it's a
it
bit
does feel
complicated,
like
but yeah,
the
ultimately it's Cloudflare.
Yeah, to me though, it does feel like the solution is VPN, which is already being pushed for the journalists, for the activists in these situations, is using a VPN.
Yeah.
Um, of course, there are places where they make the VPN illegal, and then that becomes a challenge. But yeah, like there isn't a lot that can be done about it apart from like Cloudflare removing the functionality, which is difficult, or obfuscating it in some way, such that only like the owner of the domain would be able to deobfuscate it. At least that's the only thing I can kind of think of as a fix. Like I can't think of something Signal could really do apart from using a different cache or
Yeah,
just like the clients.
it's
I'm
not
glad
a broadly fixable issue.
Yeah, I am glad Cloudflare paid out a bounty for it. And it is because this is a clever way of using this information and of using the ability to isolate the data centers. Like, definitely a good find and just really good, like I said, kind of thought process or thinking about how you can abuse this rather than just trying to look for or pattern match to your classic attacks. It's, I see this thing that feels sketchy. What can I do with it? And figuring that out. So, like, it's a good find.
Yeah, and I kind of like seeing these practical zero-click attacks because I feel like a lot of people have that thinking, and I definitely have fallen into this category too, where you don't think about your security being compromised on chat apps as long as you're, if like I don't click on malicious links, so I'm fine. And in most cases that is true. Like it's pretty rare that someone's going to be able to hit you through a chat application with no interaction on your part. But this is one of those cases where, if you do fall into that threat model where it matters to you, that doesn't hold true. Just having push notifications on, for example, could be enough to compromise you. So yeah, I kind of like that aspect of it too.
Yeah.
All right. So continuing on some web stuff, we have a post from PortSwigger on stealing HTTP only cookies with the cookie sandwich technique. I wasn't really familiar with this technique, and it's a little bit confusing at first, to be honest, at least to me. And Z and I were actually talking a little bit before the episode, trying to get a better understanding of it. But it is a pretty interesting and cool technique, and I'll let Z take it away.
Yeah, and fundamentally, it is a pretty simple bug. Just the way it was documented had a little bit of confusion over it.
The
Um,
practicality is where the confusion was, I should clarify.
yeah. So this is following up on a post we talked about a few episodes back with the phantom version cookies, and what that was calling out was the fact that an earlier RC for cookies, you would include this version kind of cookie looking thing, attribute, whatever. You'd include this sort of special cookie in there, $ version, and that could in some cases, particularly they call it Apache's Tomcat, if it saw that, or if it saw the cookie string starting with the version attribute, then it would fall back into like its legacy, parsing this with the older RFC and allowing whatever that allowed in it, or otherwise it would just carry on with like normal cookie parsing. So basically what they end up doing here is, well, cookie sandwich kind of gives you a hint at what's going on, but they basically trick the parser by including a cookie that starts with, so they get it into the older, using the JavaScript example here, they set up like document cookie, so you do require some sort of vulnerability that would let you set arbitrary cookies uh on the page, or whatever. So like an XSS might be able to do this. And what they're going for is leaking an HTTP only cookie, which normally your JavaScript would not be able to access. So you need kind of an oracle that provides that also. So you do need some other vulnerabilities. But the attack going on here is, first they set up a version equals one cookie. So you need something that would let you do that, even though cookies starting with a $ is technically not valid. If you can set that, then you'll be able to, when it gets sent, it could trick the parser into treating this as like the older cookie and parsing it differently. And then they create another cookie here, which is just contains one double quote. And so when the parser hits that and it falls into legacy mode, it's going to keep reading the rest of the cookie until it reaches another double quote. And so what can end up happening is, if they can get that version cookie to be the start of it, then their kind of injected cookie that has just a single double quote in it to be next. And then the browser is going to insert, and so that's just like your first two cookies. The browser is going to insert whatever cookies it has, which can include HTTP only cookies in the, like, as a cookie when it's sending this over to the server. So they have session ID as the example. The browser includes the session ID. I'm just going to scroll down, I think, to this example here where they've set as like version, they've set a random cookie with dead beef, and then PHP session ID or sesh ID gets included by the browser because it knows, okay, that's next cookie. And then they have another cookie here called dummy, which has the double quote again to kind of end it off. Now, when the server goes to parse that, it's going to parse this all as one cookie called session containing all of this. Which includes that secret value, and then they had a vulnerability that would echo whatever the session value was, allowing them to leak the session ID. So this does depend on having a vulnerability that lets you set cookies, which I've definitely seen that primitive a handful of times before. Like it can exist. It's most like the obvious cases as a side effect of excess. So this would be a way of escalating cross-site scripting to steal the cookie. And you need something that is going to echo that back out as when it's included as part of another cookie. But still, it's an interesting attack, kind of taking advantage of the different cookie parsing rules here. They go into a little bit more detail, but like the gist of it is basically just the dangling double quote, allowing it to carry on or carry over into the next cookies incorrectly.
So
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, so as you say, like the core of how this works is pretty straightforward. You have that quote issue. It's sort of classic. It's there's been lots of bugs that have been based on that same premise before. Where I was a little bit confused with the practicality was how you would get that ordering of the cookies. Because like you have to get that cookie in first to have that dangling quote to get everything else included, right? And what's not super obvious, but how you pointed out to me that you think it works, is in the get request for the path, because they have the like cookie name as an attribute there. So they have like get /JSON ? Session equals ignored. That's how they're able to get that controlled session cookie as a priority to get it put up first.
So they have, I'll pull it up here. For the version cookie to be sent first, it must either be created earlier or have a path attribute longer than all other cookies.
The way I believe it,
the way I believe this works is like basically the path, when it's matching more of the path, that means that cookie gets higher precedence over other cookies. And so it gets sent first. So yeah, they do kind of call it out here. It's easy to miss as you think you kind of understand what's going on. You scroll through this, but yeah, they do call it. They use path, and I should have mentioned that. I completely blanked on that, but yeah, that's the other trick they kind of use here, is using path in order to control the cookie ordering for their particular endpoint that reflected this, which was the /JSON endpoint. So by using the path /JSON, they were able to get some of the cookies out earlier, and then their dummy cookie that kind of ends it to be later. And of course, the session ID is probably not going to have a path. They're probably going to want that included along with all the pages, so it's probably just set to a / or usually will just be set something like that. Yeah, it's a cool technique. It's one of those tricks to kind of keep in your back pockets. Like I said, I've definitely been in that case where you've had kind of control of cookies, but then what do I do with that? Like, don't really have a lot of good attacks with that. There's like cookie jar overflow is one, but actually that's really the only one that comes to mind. Is like when you have that primitive and not like a direct, oh, I can control this cookie to do X, Y, or Z, is like cookie jar overflow is the only one that really comes to mind. So this is just another one you can kind of add in there as a test case.
So I guess we can get into our last post here, which is by Sam Curry on hacking Subaru, tracking and controlling cars via the STARLINK admin panel. So it starts off with looking at the My Subaru mobile app, which you can kind of use to, unlock the doors and whatever. Pretty much all the modern vehicles have this functionality. And they were curious to see if they could hack it. So they looked at the traffic between the app and the servers, and it looked fairly uninteresting, looked fairly good at first. But after reaching out to collaborate with somebody else,
kind of limited at first. wasn't
Yeah, I
it?
mean it. Well,
Like
it
they
just
just
looked
had a
like
login page. So not
yeah,
necessarily strong, just like no attack surface.
yeah, it just wasn't any on like on off the attack surface. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, after reaching out to somebody else, the shoves person, they noticed an interesting host name that was used for the CNAME for the my.subaru.com domain. It goes to subarucs.com. And ultimately, they found the admin portal at portal.prod.subarucs.com. And the admin portal turned out to be a little bit worse in terms of its security. So they found a JavaScript file that was responsible for facilitating the login, and ultimately, they found that there was a reset password endpoint that would reset an account's password with no authorization token. So you could literally just provide an email and reset the password on it. Now, they did need to have a valid email to do that with. Luckily for them, they'd found an endpoint, this get security question endpoint, which they could use to enumerate emails because it could be used as an oracle to tell you if an invalid email was provided. After doing some enumerating and guessing, they found an email that worked. They were able to use this to reset a password on an account and log into that account. Now, they then talk about the fact that there's 2FA, which you would initially you think of that and you're like, oh wow, okay, cool. So there was this meme of a bug, this sucks that you had something so stupid, but at least there's two-factor authentication, points to Subaru. The problem is that two-factor auth was only enforced on the client side. You just had to remove the model overlay and then you could use the admin panel as normal. So this was just really stupid all across the board. When you were able to exploit this issue and get access to the admin panel, you could do quite a few interesting things. You could get a lot of information, including like the VIN number and all that. You could get the location history of the vehicle, where you would have timestamps, the odometer reading, and the location. You could unlock and lock the vehicle via STARLINK. There's a lot of stuff that you could do here with an admin account through STARLINK. So the impact there is quite high. And the chain to get there is just sort of unbelievable. um, I guess they thought because the admin panel, they didn't expect people to really find it. They just didn't care to secure it properly. But it
Well,
was
if
a
they
chain of
had,
really comical issues that enabled this.
yeah, I mean, my guess is that it just wasn't tested for security. Like they had 2FA, at least, appeared to have 2FA, a client-side enforcement. Which, I mean, interestingly, we have actually seen that sort of issue before. Like, I think Twitter actually had, not on login in particular, it was one of the upgraded authentication prompts that kind of
Mhm.
did that same thing where it was just client-side enforcement. So, like, it happens. Like, they had it, they thought they had it at least, and turns out it just wasn't a very effective thing. Probably not tested. And that's the thing, these sort of internal applications often are very soft targets
The
because the
problem was
thought
when that
is,
internal application is accessible to the wide area network.
yeah, well, just in
Um,
general, like it's a problem when soft targets are accessed unexpectedly, basically.
yeah.
And like it's real. I mean, I've seen a lot of very weak internal applications because the thought process is the only people using this are trusted, the only people who know about it are trusted. And so they just have weak security. Whether or not it's true that the only people who are able to access it are actually trusted, the thought process means just less time is spent on actually trying to secure it. I do want to kind of call one thing out when it comes, and I'll be honest, I've had this feeling a number of times when reading Sam Curry's posts. This sort of bug, somewhat, it's meme issues. It's not like these are super interesting bugs. What's
They're funny,
interesting is
but
their,
yeah.
yeah, like their main interesting aspect is purely on the impact side. But the thing is, he did attack a legitimate employee account of Subaru. This is going to be against the terms of most bug bounty platforms. And that's kind of a feeling I've got with a number of Sam Curry posts is, yeah, and he's actually talked about, like, on their Apple posts that the hackers go after Apple, like, oh, Apple pays out regardless of whether or not it's in scope. Therefore, we'll, not care about scope and just like attack all these things. And so they found these attack services that weren't in scope. And so other people would generally avoid them. And they, of course, were weak because they're not being tested. And that kind of feels like what happened here. So I feel like Sam Curry gets a bit of a pass because of the history. He can kind of point to be like, I'm a legitimate security researcher. I have this history of doing this work, reporting it, and like not actually abusing these things. But even with a lot of bug bounties, like once you had access to the internal application, it should have stopped there. Not going on to then check on your mother's location and like adding yourself onto your friend's card to show that you could do it. Like a lot of times, proving that impact is also something that you shouldn't do on bug bounties because, like, at this point, it's a legitimate breach. A customer's information has been accessed, including their location information. Like, and to be clear, it doesn't actually talk about what they're off. Maybe they were actually authorized to hack on this, and like, I don't know what the scope actually was. It's not really brought out in this post, or it's not mentioned at all in this post. It's just you definitely have to be careful if you're wanting to kind of copy this sort of thing. Like at this point, like if this were especially, European GDPR, like this would be considered a breach. And they would have to go through all of the whole standard breach process at this point. Because the bug bounty hunters aren't actually like internal employees or hired employees for doing this sort of having access to this or having any agreement on confidentiality or anything like that, even if they do it. So like you do have to be careful with this. Like I do feel a little bit like some of Sam Curry's posts are perhaps thinking like putting things that maybe you shouldn't be doing, and he's generally gotten away with it. I think because you have that history. But if you don't have that history, I'd be very careful about it because this could turn poorly. Like in the US, we've talked about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act being kind of vague in terms of what is unauthorized access. Even when you think you're like acting fine, it's purely a policy reason that the department, and that's only as of like 2021 or 2022 or something, that the Department of Justice doesn't enforce CFAA against good faith researchers, but you have to kind of show you're a good faith researcher somehow. Either way, just a word of warning. I kind of, when I saw him actually, attack through a legitimate employee account, that just feels a little bit sketchy to me when it comes to doing this testing. So be aware. I don't know what all went into it for him getting permission to test, or if there was, or what the scope of the program is. So it could be absolutely nothing. It's just something to be aware of.
Yeah, and it's probably something that should have been called out in the post because I've seen some other people discussing that aspect in like the Twitter replies to him shouting out this post. So it is something to at least be aware of, as you say. That said, there's something in the addendum that kind of ties into that a little bit that I hadn't really thought about before, but as you were talking, I was reading it, and it's kind of a fair point. Um, and that is this paragraph where he says, the auto industry is unique that an 18-year-old employee from Texas can query the billing information of a vehicle from California, and it won't really set off any alarm bells. It's part of their normal day-to-day job. The employees have all access to a ton of personal information, and the whole thing relies on trust. And that is kind of a fair thing to point out, is that there probably should be some like additional checks and balances on, like, even if you are an employee that has authorized access to these panels, there probably should be some kind of like mitigation against being able to just query anybody across like the whole country or whatever. um there probably should be some safeguards for that, honestly, if we're being real about it, whether it's an unauthorized access or not.
Perhaps like enforcing 2FA would be a good safeguard in there.
Yeah, fair enough.
I mean, yes, I agree. I think that where is Subaru based out of? Like,
I
I
believe
don't
it's
know a lot.
Japan. I believe they're a Japanese company. Yeah,
Like,
they
are
are.
there data protection laws in Japan?
I
Like, is there anything like that going on? Because that feels like part. Like, I feel like if this were a European company, there would be a lot more lockdown about this information because a lot of that would be considered somewhat identifying, and so just would be difficult. But actually, I guess, and this also comes down to Starlink. So this might also come down to like Starlink as a company, and then Subaru just kind of like rehost the panel sort of deal. And then Starlink, of course, is US. So like not really having the data protection laws. Yeah, I don't know, but that does feel a little bit like I agree that like it would be good for there to be auditing. So, and maybe there is like an audit panel that can actually see what somebody queried and not necessarily looked at like immediately, but perhaps that would actually trigger something that's just it's out of band. Like with a lot of accounting services and stuff, like the protective mitigations tend to exist like somewhat out of band from the actual system when they run like their whatever monthly events. I don't know enough on that field to actually say. I just understand there are kind of out of band systems at
yeah,
work that help, and that could be the case here too.
yeah, it could be like logging and policy enforced rather than technology, but I mean, yeah, we've kind of seen in the past how flimsy those can be. So
Yeah,
ideally
I'll
it would
be
be
honest.
technology, but
I don't like the fact that the vehicle's actually tracking all of this and saving it in the first place. Like, there's that aspect too, and I'm not sure if you like if this is on even if you don't have a Starlink account. Like, they very well may still be tracking or probably are tracking location information, even if you don't have the Starlink actually, because it is like a monthly fee or whatever. But the vehicle still has Starlink, so it's probably still reporting everything, and you just don't get like the nice features with unlocking it or whatever.
yeah, it's hard for me to imagine why they do like what justification they have for doing that location tracking actually.
Sell it to
Um
the advertisers, the insurance companies. That it's
I
data
mean,
that they
yeah,
can sell. 100%.
100%. Yeah, but like trying to justify it like it's just
Why
kind of
do
hard for
they
me to
don't need to
imagine why you.
justify it? Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Like they don't need to justify collecting the information to anybody because it's not protected information.
Yeah.
Like it's data protection laws. We in the US and Canada, like there's very little protecting your data, so they can collect what they want. As long as they can collect it, it's fair game. And it's not like you have a choice over like, because in
Yeah.
fairness here, like I mean, Starlink with Subaru, Starlink I think is also maybe used with I want to say GMC, but I'm not sure. Either way, like pretty much every manufacturer has some sort of system like this, with like tracking location information and stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of why I got into that discussion is I wish I remembered the exact topic so I could reference the episode, but we have actually talked about location tracking with vehicles before.
Not sure if that's the one you're thinking of, but like, Sam Curry also has a post with hacking Kia vehicles, and also there's another auto industry one where I know they have geolocation information here with the Kia stuff. I did a quick control F for like information on repoing them, but couldn't find that. So I'm not sure if either of these are the posts you're thinking of. But
I
they did
might be
have like,
misremembering too, to be fair. Like it's just a, like I said, I couldn't really go and find it very easily, but yeah, I
yeah,
do
like
remember us having a discussion around it before.
yeah, a lot of these, like I'm pretty sure we've talked about these when they came out, or at least I'm not sure if we did the Kia one. I'm pretty sure we did web hackers versus the auto industry though.
Yeah.
Um, and it is more of like these dealership type back end applications with issues. So I vehicles generally aren't known for their security, and especially given things we've covered here before.
But yeah, I mean, it's out of like the posts that we talk about that have impact, the car ones like this, the impact's pretty damn high. So yeah, you would hope to expect some, better security on the admin panel side. And like you said, I think it was ultimately just, it's internal, it's a soft target. Uh, they probably some of the people working on it might not have even known that it was exposed to the internet like that. So, that's probably what happened there. But yeah, it's really
I don't
stupid.
know. I feel like exposed to the internet, they probably would have needed to realize, just given like the type of use case. Like they're expecting people to log into this with emails. It's not.
Well, like a lot of those systems, though, you have like a company VPN or something, right? Where they have some level of access that gates it off from just anybody on the internet. So that's kind of
Maybe.
my thinking of why they might not have thought that it needed to be tested as much. But either way, I mean, it was terrible. But
Yeah, I have no idea if Subaru actually like uses that sort of implementation. But actually, to be clear, I think that I'm a fan of zero trust, where everything
yeah,
is just kind of assumed to be, access from the internet and enforce your like login and all of that on it, rather than having these soft targets. But yeah, I don't know. We don't know enough internally about that to really comment.
yeah. I mean, it's fun to speculate on a little bit, but either way, like, yeah, it's kind of inexcusable on Subaru's part. So
So I'm just going to call out the website here. I keep wanting to just scroll down to the bottom, and there is no scroll bar on this website.
I
I can
noticed that
scroll it,
too when we were
but I
covering it.
can't like just jump to the bottom.
Yeah. Well, actually, so that's a Chrome thing because on Firefox you do have a scroll bar, but on Chrome, I guess they style it and remove it,
Chrome, you can just hide
which
it. Yeah,
which
definitely great usability
annoying.
there.
Yeah, one of those things where it's design over function. Yeah, I don't love it either. But yeah.
I
So
did want
unless
to,
you
sorry, I want to shout out the timeline here where they sent their initial report out and vulnerability. It looks like, initial response from Subaru was like 7:40 a.m. and it was fixed by 4 p.m. And they sent the email at 11:54 p.m. The day before. So basically, within 24 hours, this was both reported and fixed.
very quick turnaround at least, yeah.
Yeah, good turnaround on it. Nothing. So for all the hate that we're giving Subaru on this, do at least want to shout out that they had a very quick response time on that.
Yeah. All right. But yeah, unless you have any more to add, Z, I think we'll wrap it up there.
Uh, no, I think we're good.
All right. So, as always, thanks goes out to everyone who tuned in. I probably should have mentioned this at the start of the episode, but we are giving a training at Hardware.io in May. That's based on hypervisor security and virtualization. So, if that is something that sounds interesting to you or somebody you know, we would appreciate you linking that out for us because trainings are something that Z and I have wanted to do for a while, and we're hoping to, continue in doing them. And yeah, so wanted to give that a quick shout out. And with that said, we will see you in the next episode.